We've now got red light.
There we go.
Are we on?
We are actually recording.
We've triumphed over technology.
Many of you will know who we are talking to today. If you don't, you're gonna by the end of this podcast. We're joined today by James Wong. James, how you doing?
Yeah, not bad. Not bad. I always feel like quite intimidated in that bit where you've got to be quiet and the other person's talking about you. And I'm like, what are they going to say? You kept it brief. That's good.
We're just going to say nice things.
Okay.
Lots of nice things.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I'm so not used to this. This isn't Twitter at all.
And that's a good thing, I feel. So, most people will know who you are. But for those of you that don't know who the hell James Wong is, how would you describe your job? But more importantly, what do you put on your car insurance? Well, this is something we have a bit of an issue with at the moment.
Oh gosh, well, see, that's the one thing I've never had to do car insurance because I don't know how to drive. But I don't really know what to describe my job as. So I'm trained as an ethnobotanist, and that's a botanist that specifically looks at plant use. So there are lots of different specializations within botany, some of which are things like taxonomy. So that's trying to figure out, using genetics largely nowadays, how plants are related to each other on the tree of life. You might look at ecology. You might look at biochemistry. I'm not smart enough to do any of those things. They're way too technical for me.
You're in good company here.
Exactly. So I describe ethnobotanist as the only kind of botanist with social skills. And I'm not saying I have a lot, but we're kind of half anthropologist, half botanist. And we basically try and figure out how people use plants for food or for medicine or for textiles or perfumery, timber, all the amazing ways that people use plants. So that's my training, but now I tend to work in media explaining that. So I might work in radio or television or writing books or have a column in New Scientist, trying to translate that kind of what can be quite dense geek speak, taking, a spreadsheet or academic study or a bunch of tables and trying to say, this is what they actually mean and this is why it's important to your life.
A few minutes ago, we asked each other, is this podcast going to be really geeky?
Yeah.
Really hope it's going to be.
Oh, I don't think it's really escapable at this point with the three of us.
So the question is, how far down the rabbit hole are we going to go?
Well, that's up to you guys. You're the boss.
Yeah, I think we should.
Let's turn up the light.
Okay.
So, at this early point in our discussion, a thought has just come to me. Would you say that you're kind of like an evangelical botanist? Would that be another way of describing your job?
I guess so. I mean, I often describe to like all my mates will describe me as someone who's playing the role of a botanist. So, I used to work at Kew Gardens. It's where I trained. And I have loads of colleagues who still work there, but I don't do research work day to day. Or, other than what I'm doing for translation work. I think my job is really to look at what all my amazing genius colleagues are doing and try to figure out a way in which I can explain that to, I would often describe as my audience as my intelligent 13-year-old cousin. So it's, trying to make it really accessible so everyone can understand it and everyone can see how it's relevant without talking down to anyone. But also, I think that the gene of loving plants and finding them fascinating and wanting to really study them in a systematic way, and the gene for wanting to get up on a soapbox and say how wonderful things are, not usually the same people, right? Loving plants and social skills, that Venn diagram doesn't really cross over. So I try and think that my job is to be the translator. My job is to say, all my mates down the pub are fascinating. They just don't know how to talk to other human beings that aren't botanists. So I can hopefully say why they're so smart and shine a light on all their amazing work.
It's interesting that you said about anthropology and botany as well, the kind of amalgamation of the two.
Oh, yeah.
It really is that. Because we've talked quite a lot with people within horticulture, and it is the effect that plants have on people.
Yes.
So interesting.
And I think we're only just beginning to really scratch the surface of it. I think, people who are plant people already, I mean, it's no surprise to anyone who's a gardener that you feel better after you've done gardening.
Yeah.
And we have a really long history of using it for therapeutic use. You know, even the Victorians were doing it, and it was used a lot after the wars, for example. Before PTSD was even a word, people were using horticulture to treat that or as part of treatment. But now we have a really good stack of scientific studies. You know, starting from the 70s, they were a little bit sketchy, but they were sort of pointing us in the right direction. They weren't always the biggest trials or the best quality trials. But what we've seen, particularly in the last couple of decades, is this mounting wave of evidence that's really beginning to stack up to show that being around plants, I mean, even looking at virtual plants on a screen can measurably improve both mental and physical health, and in ways that aren't necessarily that obvious. Things like improved feelings of self-worth, which is quite fuzzy, but also in a much more measurable way, reduced need for pain medication in some circumstances in the right context. And so, yeah, I mean, it is kind of fascinating. If you could think of a drug, if plants were a drug that you could give to people that helped reduce levels of stress hormones, helped improve feelings of self-worth, helped improve exercise performance, helped improve memory and concentration, and it did all of these things, and the only side effect was that your house looked a bit nicer.
It's a bit greener.
Maybe like it helped wildlife in your back garden. Those are pretty good side effects.
Absolutely.
And for the amount of financial outlay, it's really low. So lots of bodies in the NHS, for example, you know, the NHS isn't exactly flush with money. They are investing in that because they see a return on that investment based on the really great data that we've seen so far.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's quite interesting because that comes across in the content that you put across on social media. Especially I find that you're not just talking about it in woolly terms. You know, how often do I casually write on social media well-being, plant-based well-being? But what I enjoy about your content is that you actually back it up with measurable kind of empirical proof. It's like, no, it's not kind of just good for you. No, it actually is good for you.
Yeah, and I think you've got to show you're working out. And I think if people are really going to make these investments and make this change in an important and positive way, if you love your subject and you're passionate about it, you also need to love the evidence to be able to convince those people who haven't had the opportunity to garden and don't know firsthand, and to also know that it doesn't benefit people who are just interested in plants. It benefits people who have no interest in plants whatsoever or don't know they have an interest, can also see that. And I think you also, to be able to do that, you can't just cherry pick the studies that prove your point. Some other studies that are, you know, that sound nice and are quite useful to trying to convince people, very good studies. So I think to really be able to talk authoritatively, you have to show that there's thousands of potential studies. These are some really good ones, and these maybe aren't. So, for example, there is a common belief that houseplants improve the air quality of rooms and they add oxygen to your room. None of that is true. When we've consistently tested it, like there used to be some evidence that was like very early, and we thought, okay, on the basis of this evidence, maybe. It was shaky, small trials. Then we got more evidence and tested it a bit more rigorously, and we found out that it's entirely untrue. So it's important to flag that up, so that we know when I claim that there is a study, or I show you that there is a study, that study is really solid and replicable. You know, if you do this same experiment, if something has a basis in fact, you should see very, very similar results even in subsequent tests.
So do you think that actually it's not necessarily a measurable, like you say, you don't get more oxygen from a plant, for instance, but the oxygen isn't there necessarily, but the well-being effects you're able to see. So is that having a measurable effect?
So
makes sense.
Totally makes sense. So what we do know is that plants have a benefit to us. Exactly why that happens is a little bit more fuzzy. And that's because plants do so many different things. Is it just, for example, the color green? Plants are green, we see them. Is it important that we see them, first of all? Is it important that the color green makes a difference? And according to some trials, it does make a difference.
Okay.
Could be something like soil bacteria are emitting things that we're able to inhale, and that affects it, which some trials have suggested, not great trials, but it maybe has nothing to do with the plant, it just has something to do with the soil. Is it the fact that you're just being distracted by something? So we know, for example, that gardening can is a great form of exercise. You can burn more calories gardening in your average gardening session than your average gym session, and yet it feels easier than a gym session. However, there's a reason for that.
Love.
So it's nothing to do with the plants necessarily themselves. It's just to do, according to this one trial, with the fact that it's low impact exercise. So housework has a similar impact. An hour of housework can burn more calories than your average gym session, and it's just low impact exercise for longer. So the important thing is you take all of these different indicators together and try and see what's going on. With plants cleaning the air, the original research was done by NASA. It was done on a range of houseplants, and they put them in these little tiny hermetically sealed chambers where the plant filled the whole chamber. And they wanted to see if on long-term space flight, plants could be used as natural air filters, natural regenerating air filters. If your air filter falls apart in space, you can't get new parts in, but plants fix themselves. So if we could do that. And there was some quite good evidence on that at the 80s, well, with a limited number of trials. However, your apartment or house is not a hermetically sealed chamber, and it's also not completely packed full of plants. So when studies have been retested on your average home where air is constantly coming in and leaving all the time, the latest evidence is that you would need 500 plants per square meter. Now that's an awful lot of plants to even fit into a square meter.
I was going to say, is that sort of
They must be stacking them when I was looking at the trial. And what's your average plant, right? Depends on the size of plant, species, time of year, etc. But the trial looked at an average plant. And I found you would need that to just replicate the benefits of a cracked window.
Wow.
Simply opening your window is much more effective. So plants do clean the air on a planetary scale, just not on a home scale. But that doesn't mean that there's not loads of other benefits, and that we know that those benefits are really stacking up. I mean, that's why it's so important that was one study, and it was a really impressive study, and it had so much media attention over 40 years, but no one really thought to retest it, and no one thought to retest it in home conditions as opposed to the artificial conditions in the lab. And when retested in home conditions, I think the study was only 2018 or something, the most recent stuff. And I think it's important. Because, in the world of fake news, it's really important to show you're working out and to show that you aren't just picking evidence to match your pre-existing belief, but you're actually showing that actually some evidence doesn't necessarily support it, but on balance it does.
See, that's fascinating. And again, that's something that I have gained from listening to you over the years. This idea that actually, sure, there's things that we repeat to each other, gardening tips and tricks that we... Like the idea that houseplants clean the air.
I was saying it all the time. Really, no one should feel bad about that. At the time, the evidence, that's all the evidence we had.
I mean, you've rocked Nate's world. She's really sad now.
No, I still know that they have all the other benefits, exactly. But yeah.
and even in terms of what they do to the atmosphere, there is some evidence, for example, that plants improve humidity in your home. Is it necessarily because they're a plant, or just the fact that you're watering something all the time?
Oh.
But, a lack of humidity is probably a bigger issue for more people, particularly in centrally heated homes in winter, than environmental pollutants. And if your plant's sorting that, it is improving your air quality, just not necessarily in the way that it's been sold to you as doing.
Yes.
This is why ethnobotany matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are, in the modern Western world, have lots of luxuries and privileges that people who live in it, like myself, don't necessarily know. And one of them is that we have the privilege of seeing plants as just pretty objects. So if I get into a cab or talk to someone in the pub or wherever, you strike up conversation, people ask you what you do. And I say I'm a botanist, just like my short answer. They're always like, oh, so you know how to lay a deck then? Or, you know how to make a flower arrangement? I'm like, actually, I have no idea how to do either of those two things. But they always assume that it's just an aesthetic, kind of a hobby about things looking pretty. And which is great, and I have a lot of respect for all of that area of horticulture. However, people don't think that the very air they're breathing is reliant on plants, the food they eat, the clothes they're wearing, literally every aspect of human survival and every major problem that faces our species in the next century, from climate change to biodiversity loss to food security to the next pandemic. Plants will be a significant part of the solution to almost all of those things. We think about them as, cut flowers, which is great because they could potentially have a benefit. But it's so much bigger than all of that.
Be honest, did you watch that Matt Damon film and feel deeply, deeply happy?
I watched the trailer first, The Martian. And he says something like, I'm a space botanist or something like that. I was like, you go, Matt. And then I watched it, and there are lots of bits where I was like, yes, that is so true. If you were to want to grow a crop to live off on another planet, potatoes would be great because they produce more calories per square meter than pretty much any other crop. Yes, tick. We do also have lots of evidence that you can live off nothing but potatoes for several years at a time because the people who domesticated the potato, or the descendants of the people who do that, still live off very little other than potatoes in the high Andes. And there have been trials where people have just been fed potatoes for over 2 years and eaten nothing else and still survived. There's very few foods that would have enough protein if you were just living on a plant-based diet, or if you were living just on an animal-based diet, things like vitamin C, potatoes sort of have it all. But he sowed potatoes that were shrink wrapped and cooked in a packet. And I was like, that's the one thing you messed up on. If you could just have had like lots of vials of some in vitro propagation or seeds, it would have been believable. But they were cooked potatoes. Rookie fail, screenwriters.
It's funny that we're talking about potatoes because we did an earlier episode on Dig for Victory. Have you heard of Potato Pete?
No, I have not. I need to hear about it. Who's this?
So Potato Pete is a mascot that was created during the Dig for Victory initiative during World War II. And yeah, it was very much advocating for potatoes being this amazing food source that will give you energy and vitamins. And so very much what you were just saying, actually.
I mean, they're sort of really fascinating because, for example, even though potatoes don't actually contain that much vitamin C, because they're such a large proportion of people's diets, they're a really important source of vitamin C.
Yeah.
And in the war particularly, that was one of the big issues, your micronutrients. Things like, they were making things like rosehip cordial. They were making things like blackcurrant cordial as a source of vitamin C. But potatoes are a really effective one. They could have done all of that and they wouldn't have succeeded if it wasn't for crops like the potato.
Yeah. No, big fan.
It was interesting because we really went down a rabbit hole. And it was just the two of us talking about Dig for Victory. And it's funny because it actually just brings together so many of the things that we've been talking about in the last 10 minutes. Because me and Kate suddenly had this revelation as we were recording this Dig for Victory episode that actually I wouldn't have been there.
Okay. Why?
I would have been called up.
Oh, of course. Oh, no.
Yes, it would have been.
So it would have been Kate doing all the digging. It would have been Kate doing all the harvesting potatoes and eating nothing but potatoes.
It says so much about the image we have of Dig for Victory today is so coloured by what would have been propaganda, what essentially was propaganda at the time, but we see in a very romantic way, didn't really reflect reality because in all of the pictures for Dig for Victory was always a bloke doing it. So you sort of so convinced into thinking that was the case. And in my family, my granddad was a farmer, so he was here. So my not my memories, but my inherited memories of Dig for Victory was him doing it. But of course, this would have been a women-led movement to a really large degree, which is, in terms of silver linings, is kind of an exciting thing that women have been marginalized in horticulture for so long, even though they actually usually the best horticulturists. All my horticultural heroes are women. So that is fascinating.
Well, trust me, if you go back and listen to, I think, the second episode of the pod, Kate tells her story.
Oh.
And she goes on the most epic rant about her experiences as a woman.
I'm all about epic rants.
It's really quite special. It involves people offering to push Danish trolleys for and other such crimes.
Hey, I would absolutely be working that. If I could get someone to do manipulate people in just the good bits, manipulate people into doing things for me, I would totally do that.
This is what I was saying. I think I've talked myself into a bit of a corner now that everybody's going to be like, well, you just push that Danish trolley on your own language you've been kicking off. So, but yeah.
I mean, we just went back into the past to Dig for Victory, but let's go back a little bit in your past.
Okay.
Because one of the questions that we like to throw out in this pod is, what was your first memory? What do you think was your first memory of growing things?
Oh, so I actually have a photo of myself doing some gardening from before I can remember what my first memory was.
Amazing.
So I thought I had my first, a eureka moment in my brain, but I have clear evidence now from my mom that I was doing it since I was probably about 2. There's a picture of me like putting up like margarine containers and putting soil in them. I'm not sure if I was making mud pies. She's very sure I was gardening. But I remember my grandma in Wales sent me a packet of seeds. It had Bambi on the front. And the description, this is like 1980s descriptions, they would never pass the Trade Act now. But it said, snapdragons snapping at each other. And I took all of this for face value. I was like, that is so awesome. So I ripped it open and I was planting the seeds. My mom was helping me. This is in Singapore, because I grew up on the other side of the world. And I remember my mom saying, okay, it says that these will come up in 14 days. I planted them and I checked the next day. And I was like, okay, still 14 days, fine. And I checked the next day and they were up. And I was like, 2 days. It said 14. Of course, tropical rainforest conditions.
Yep.
Things come up really, really fast. And I was so excited. And they got to like 10 centimeters.
Yep.
And I was like, I'm a prodigy. Whoever's written this packet doesn't have my skill. And then, of course, in tropical conditions, they get fungal diseases, bacterial wilts. They all damped off. They all just look terrible. And I never got to see the snapdragons.
Oh, no.
And they say that there's this formula that frustration plus desire equals obsession. And I think that's the case. I think I've been chasing that horticultural dragon / trying to get over my trauma. Because, I mean, the thing I love apart from just being around plants, is the experimentation.
Yeah.
And trying to do something new or trying to do something that books say you can't. Very often there's a good reason why the books say you can't, because you can't. And then sometimes you realize that it's actually rubbish and there is an alternate way of doing things. And to me, it's like the closest thing to magic. The fact that you can just put seeds in soil without you doing anything.
Yeah.
They just appear. I once got in trouble for saying in an interview that I found horticulture exciting. Apparently, that's an inappropriate word to use in horticulture. Apparently, it's engaging. Not everything has to be Americanized and exciting like a roller coaster. It has to be engaging or absorbing. And I was like, if you don't feel excited when seeds come up, your soul is dead and there's nothing I can do for you. Because either those people don't feel excitement, or why are they doing gardening?
I think that's the thing. Yeah, that's kind of why we asked the question in terms of what was your first experience of growing, because there always is that excitement of the first experience of I've just planted something and it's come up out of the ground. That's, like you say, that's magic.
I mean, it's the miracle of life.
Exactly.
Except you get a direct hand in it. I think, lots of people feel that, I think almost everyone, even if they're not a gardener, they can go on a walk in a woodland and sort of feel that there's something amazing going on with nature and feel inspired. Even if you're not a plant person, even if you're not an outdoor person, I think they can sort of see that and feel it. But I think that's really about appreciating the natural world in quite a passive way, because you're just witnessing it. Whereas when you're doing horticulture, you're actually making an intervention. It's something you did that is resulting in the miracle you can see. Yeah. So you planted that seed, you pruned that plant, you did whatever you needed to do, and that happened. So to me, it's much more powerful. So I often think that people feel like they can't get in touch with horticulture. Like if you can go on a walk in a woodland and be moved, horticulture is just the much best and bigger drug. It's like eating while watching the Food Network. You get to do both.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there is such a tango that takes place between kind of working with nature, trying to acknowledge nature, but also shape it to meet your objectives. And my gran grew up on a farm during World War II.
Yeah.
And she was an interesting character. She didn't tolerate fools gladly.
Yeah. I think that's everyone's grand in that year.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Otherwise, we'd have got along really well.
Yeah.
And she always said to me that it's this incredible relationship between trying to shape the narrative, but also just throwing your hands in the air and saying, actually, winter's coming. You can't, we've just got unlucky here.
Yeah.
I
think that's what teaches you about horticulture as well. Horticulture is sort of a lesson in life because you have to know what you can control and what you can't control. And the fact that sometimes when you just give up a bit of control, it actually works out better. There's lots of simple life lessons that what plants are teaching me all the time.
And it's like talking to her again, actually, because that's the exact point that she gave to me time and time again. I think it's interesting what you said about 5 minutes ago about just trying to break the rules. Bend, maybe not break them. I'm using the word exciting. Bend.
How dare you?
I still haven't got over it. This is 10 years ago. I'm still how could you say that?
Yeah. We've all had those moments, and I'm pretty sure that we could do a podcast just on
old horticulture.
Yeah. I mean, my personal favourite was, I think there was some message that we got about all I do is stand in the door of the polytunnel looking sexy.
Oh, is that what you do? I've seen this Instagram. I haven't seen any kind of thong shots or anything.
I actually...
You took them down.
Oh, okay.
I was really happy with that. I was like, I've still got it. Something I want to run by you. It's a bit of a theory that we've been working on behind the scenes.
Okay.
Maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know if this was a thing down in London, but Burnley and Birmingham chili festivals.
Oh, yeah. Across the UK, which is fascinating considering how new that is in the UK.
It became a real trend. And as we were working at these chili festivals, I was looking at the people who were buying the chili plants, the people who were taking part in the chili eating competition. And they were very much geeking out about the Scoville scale.
The rating, like the Richter scale of spiciness, basically. The scientific, slightly dodgy scientifically, but the scientific scale by how you judge chili spiciness.
You see, I like this.
Yeah.
Go on.
It's slightly dodgy because it's subjective. So the Scoville scale is how many times you have to dilute that chili before you can't taste it anymore. But that's subjective.
That's what I always thought it was subjective.
Yeah.
I wondered how they did it.
Taste panels.
Oh.
Get a bunch of people in, but people have different sensitivity. So it really should be, but everyone's stuck on the Scoville scale now, and it kind of works.
Yeah.
But if this is the Olympics and you're doing that, photo finish cutoff line, what you would have to do is percentage capsaicin, the spicy chemical that's found in chilies, per dry weight or per wet weight, and then you could get the gold standard. Scoville scale, I mean, it isn't terrible. It's still useful as an indicator. Once you start getting into the millions of units as well, it starts to become not much of a muchness.
Yeah.
It isn't 100%. So I'm a bit weird like that. I have to have the correct number.
A true scientist.
It worries me. It worries me slightly because if Kate was on the testing, then the jalapeno would be rated.
I was going to say everything.
1 million.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. And it's relatively objective, your ability to sense chili. We do know that you can become accustomed to it quite quickly.
Okay.
We know that through a university trial where the professor was spraying capsaicin up the noses of his students.
Oh, that's good.
And they found out that after a while, the people who are really, really sensitive to it can become desensitized. What?
Oh, those poor people.
I know, it's like a lot of these trials, and it's sort of abuse of students, but so yeah, that's one of the surprising things. But what was really cool is if you look at Dr. Z.G. Hession, like the guy who wrote the Gardening or the Expert series of gardening books, biggest fan. His houseplant book for me as a child just was like exploding in my brain. They haven't been updated, those books, since probably the early 80s.
Really?
Yeah. So, or maybe they have a little bit, but the text, I think, has stayed exactly the same. Because if you read what he has to say about chilies, and I think the most recent version I have is at least from the mid-2000s. And it says, chilies are only to be ever tried if they're part of your heritage, because no one would ever want to eat them. And then it says that something about garlic, as in garlic will never be popular in Britain. It is an abomination from Europe.
Oh, I completely disagree with that.
So, I mean, while some parts of gardening land are still saying that no one ever wants to have them, like a whole different universe of gardening land is having a whole festival dedicated to almost a pilgrimage towards the chili, something that apparently we're never supposed to have.
And that's exactly it. Because we were looking over at the people that had gathered for this I love the way you describe it as like a chili festival, like a pagan festival. And they were completely different people.
Yes.
To anybody that I had ever sold plants to.
Yes.
Before. And by the way, this is a huge exercise in generalization. But these were people.
It's true. I've seen it, and I have been to different ones to you, and it's very apparent when you go through the front door.
And would you say the phrase counterculture is kind of... They're all people that I would say pride themselves on being a little bit different.
Okay. It depends on your definition. I would say that they probably think so. I used to say it's lots of hipsters. Yeah, the question is, are hipsters countercultural, or are they just very, very mainstream? We're saying this in West London, so I can say that safely. Someone coming in and throwing a latte over me, an organic latte over me. But yeah, it's definitely, there is a ironic beard, braces, looking like you've come out of what people from Alabama look like in films. And that's a very different look, like 20s, 30-somethings. And it's a very different look from what you would see in a regular flower show, you know. It's a very different demographic in almost every way, which is exciting to see.
And what we heard time and time again was the idea, my garden looks different to anybody else.
Yeah.
You know, I just grow this random plant.
Yeah.
And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah.
There's that word again.
I mean, you know what's exciting about it? I think what is really exciting about it is when you go to places like that, the questions that people ask.
Yeah.
Because the questions are usually incredibly in-depth, that display a huge amount of pre-existing knowledge. These aren't, I mean, there are lots of beginners there, but they aren't just people wanting to know the basic stuff that has been taught in gardening books for 50 years and asking the same questions. They have a huge amount of level of knowledge, often very niche in a specific subject, and have really done their homework and want to know more. And I think that there's a big difference between something being a fad, like a TikTok trend that people are just aping, and something that there's really deeply engaged with and deeply excited about it and have invested lots of time and interest in going down the rabbit hole. And that, you know, that is when something isn't going to be like an acai bowl, like, you know, here, there, gone tomorrow kind of fad. It's something that is really a change in how people are thinking about plants. So for me, that's really exciting.
And we were saying just before we started recording that maybe the huge change that has accelerated all of these trends that we're talking about is maybe the pandemic, although we saw this increasing before COVID was a thing. I think certainly the pandemic accelerated these trends and changed the way that we look at growing things. So do you think that ethnobotany is more relevant post-pandemic?
Oh, I think ethnobotany has always been, people are genetically predisposed to find plants interesting. Even our very field of color vision, we can see more shades of green than we can any other color, like by a very, very long way. If you look at a graph, if you draw a graph, it's very boring, and you do like the color spectrum, green is in the middle, you basically end up with this kind of bell-shaped curve of us being able to detect loads more green than we can red and blue. And it's basically because it allows us to be better botanists. When we were running around the Serengeti, we could distinguish between plants better, and therefore we could tell the difference between toxic and tasty plants in a much more effective way. So that's just one example of the very way we see the world.
That's amazing.
But like every bit of our, like the fact that our eyes are on the front of our head, we've got binocular vision, they're not on the sides of our head. It's because we were running around trees or swinging around trees. We had to be able to have three-dimensional vision to be able to grab hold of a branch and swing on it. Our opposable thumbs have come from that. So almost every aspect of our basic biology, the human condition, the way we structure civilization is based around billions of years of coevolution with plants. Whether we knew it or not, that was the case. I think the difference is we may now realize it a bit more.
Yeah.
So we're definitely, I think, in the pandemic, we realized what it was like to be stuck at home so much, and we began to value outdoor space more. When we would have that 1 hour a day in which we could escape, you would go to a park. I saw people in parks that I go to the park every day. And I saw all these people who I'd never seen there before, and now they all keep going. And it's really frustrating because I want the party to myself, thanks.
You were here first.
Yeah, I go to Kew Gardens. There's all these young, beautiful people kicking around everywhere. That was really upsetting. I used to be the youngest one. And I used to have it to myself, and it's just really exciting. And not just the demographic in terms of age, demographic in terms of things like ethnicity, I think is really exciting. You know, I definitely, when I used to go to Chelsea Flower Show, not even that long ago, like 10 years ago, I was the only person.
Yeah.
And then now I kind of feel so much less special because it's, you go to somewhere like Kew Gardens, the people who are inside Kew Gardens resemble the population that you see on the tube. Normally, when you would go to these events, like it was like a complete, like a filter would happen at the gates, and only certain people would be allowed in.
Yeah.
So I think the pandemic has sort of really helped us realize how nature is important, and maybe helped people figure out that they're allowed to do that, that like they can go even if they're not part of what you might think is the club.
It's really interesting that you say allowed, because I think that's something that we've talked about in previous episodes in terms of horticulture. I think can sometimes seem quite intimidating.
Absolutely.
In that way.
Absolutely.
And I think with the pandemic, people, like you say, realising that actually plants have such a regenerative well-being effect and they can actually help you to feel better. Do you actually think the next generation of people who potentially will be working in horticulture as a career actually will be sort of coming through now because it's slightly more accessible, maybe?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I definitely, when you look at social media, which is, I think, also a really big force, that you can see people who look like you, who may be different to you. You can see them from all over the world, who aren't following the standard gardening advice. And that's because when I was growing up, like, well, let's say I grew up my whole life in the UK, which I didn't, but even in Singapore, if you would look to gardening media, we basically had British gardening media, a bit of American and a bit of Australian, but all very similar. And so every March since 1993, it's been telling you how to sow tomatoes. And I can tell you, in 2053, it will tell you in the March issue of Gardener's World how to sow tomatoes. And there's nothing wrong with that. There will always be beginners. But the amazing thing about the internet, I can go and see what Japanese people are doing in March. And it may be sowing tomatoes, but it might be completely different varieties. They might be doing them in completely different ways. They might be using cuttings. When you go to places like Japan and China, one of the key ways to propagate potatoes is by seed. Who would ever do that? It's completely, I don't think it's even legal in the UK, literally because of biosecurity. But no one would ever do that.
Yeah.
And I think it's really fascinating to be able, for us to be able to see that as much as I love pie and mash, I would like to eat maybe a curry sometime. I would like to have like a Peruvian ceviche. We've become so much more international in the way we think about food. But gardening, it's only really just now that we've got out of like spam and pie and mash. You started going, oh, other people do this too, and maybe they do it in a way that I'd like to explore.
Yeah.
And that's not to be critical in any way of traditional British horticulture. It's just that saying, you know, if you would go to the ice cream store, vanilla is a perfectly nice flavor. I often order it, but there are other flavors. And if you don't like vanilla, it doesn't mean you don't like ice cream. There are other ice cream flavors available.
And it's particularly, I think, interesting because for us, developing as a business in a place like Birmingham, which is so incredibly multicultural, our customers genuinely reflected planet Earth.
Yeah.
And I mean that, you know, if you work somewhere like Birmingham University, you learn so much just from casual encounters.
And particularly with herbs, because you have that nexus of people maybe not be going to you because they're interested in gardening, but they're interested in food and trying to get some ingredients that they may not be able to get hold of.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And how they use, like what bits they use, what varieties that you must have learned, like a two-way process. I learned a lot from them about how they use things in a different way.
We always say that we learn 3 times much from our customers as they will ever learn from us.
That's so interesting.
I remember there was a variety of Japanese parsley.
I think like a Mitsuba?
Yeah, with the big leaf.
Yes.
And I remember that I made this woman's day.
Oh, really?
Outside of, Birmingham University did a food market.
Yeah.
And, you know, she was saying that this is really niche, that she only thinks this comes from perhaps the part of Japan that she is from.
Yes.
And, I mean, she didn't buy any. So
Made a very
Maybe she didn't have a garden, but I think it is. I mean, I think the last thing that people forget about their culture when there's immigration is food. Like, first generation holds on to language, sometimes second generation, third and fourth don't necessarily, but they definitely hold on to food.
Yeah.
And it's that connection, which I think is interesting, but it's also how people, so I used to live in Ecuador when I was doing my master's, and everywhere in Ecuador, you see lemongrass. It's literally everywhere. And in Southeast Asia, where I grew up, also everywhere. The bit that they use and the bit they use it for is completely different. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, it's always the base of the stem, the bit we would use in the UK, because that's where we have the cultural influence from. You peel off the outer stalks and you use the tender inside bit of almost like the bulb at the base of the stem. If you go to Latin America, it's always the top growth. It's the like fibrous, what like we chuck away in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Because instead of grinding it to a paste to make a smooth, even curry paste, what they use it for is to make tea. So it's only ever considered a sweet ingredient, not a savory one.
Wow.
And it's always the top bits because they have much more of the lemony flavor, and it doesn't matter if they're filled with fiber because you're going to chuck it away. And I think that's interesting because when I've tried to grow lemongrass in the UK, and you can grow it really effectively, you don't really get big bulbs and you don't really have a huge amount of that stuff. What you end up with is loads of leaves. And I was like, well, there's no point in doing this. Well, there is if you're Colombian or you're wanting to make something from Colombia, Ecuador, those regions, because they use a different bit. If you're wanting to make tea, it's really great. If you're wanting to make curry, it's probably not that great. So it's just about I wouldn't have known that had I not learned about how other people use the plant. So yes,
it brings us together, doesn't it? As well, I think it really does. At a time when I think there's more than a few things that divide people.
Exactly.
There's a variety that I absolutely love, lovage.
Oh yes,
and it was out of favour.
Yeah,
I think it's fair to say.
Yeah,
for quite a while in this country. And a couple of years ago, I had a Polish guy helping me out on the stand. And he said, I'm going to write the name in Polish on the label. He said, trust me.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He said, trust me. He said, there's a lot of Polish people walking past. They're going to love it.
Yeah.
And I can't pronounce it. Lubczyk, I think.
I don't know why you're looking at me. I have no idea.
Any Polish listeners, message us. Tell us the correct way to say it. But
okay.
Lubczyk, I think they call it. And there's an old wives' tale that goes with it that if you make a drink using lovage, whoever drinks it falls in love with you.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
that's why it's in all the stock cubes. Then, like pretty much all stock cubes use it, and I have often wondered why. Like, did the person who create the formula with it? Because Germany uses it a lot as well. Is it because Nestle or one of the big companies might be Swiss or German, and maybe it's the same recipe that's sold around the world? The one place that people who've never had lovage will have had it before is stock cubes, and you'll smell it and you go, that's what it is. So yeah, I went through, like, maybe that's like you're supposed to fall in love with the big multinational stock cube manufacturer, and that's why they're adding it in.
I've been making
it's a conspiracy.
Yeah,
I've been making Kate lovage tea for you.
I knew there was an explanation. It's like, finally, there's the reason.
But I think it's really cool the way that you've just gone around the world with lemongrass.
Right. And that's the great thing about plants. People can go around the world with them, and you can learn so much about other cultures, and the same plant is seen by different people within a completely different perspective. If I was to tell my Borneo grandma that my Welsh grandma was not putting ginger in her chicken stew and would think that was kind of weird, but was grinding up ginger and putting it in biscuits, she'd be like, what's wrong with her? Like, it's like putting garlic in biscuits. It's considered such a savory thing. And the bit that is usually used in the UK, traditionally, stem ginger, is basically you have to plant ginger. When it comes straight out of the ground, it's white, it's not brown, it's not scaly. You use that, it's called stem ginger. And it's the same plant, it's the same bit of the plant, but it's just at a different stage of freshness, and it has a completely different texture. But even in the UK, most people only know stem ginger from when it's candied and preserved. They've never actually grown it. And to be able to learn that about your own culture, I think is fascinating. Now, there's not a huge amount of reason to grow ginger if you live in the UK because it's so cheap and widely available, but it's the only way you can really get hold of stem ginger. You very rarely see it in Chinatown. If you see it, it's frozen. It's lost a little of its flavor. Simply plant ginger in a pot, get some leaves to come up. Once it's grown a bit, you dig that white tuber up, and it's much more delicate. It's much more fragrant. It's less spicy. There's actually a chemical change that happens when it matures and becomes brown. So instead of being hot, it's more sort of resinous, more like galangal. And I think that's fascinating. Same plant, just asking different people how they use it and learning from them. And you can even learn about your own culture that way.
I was going to say, you learn so much about different cultures just by cooking in the way that they do. It's amazing.
And that really, I think, controversially to non-UK listeners, go on. I think that British food is is probably the best food in the world. And I don't mean traditionally British food. What I mean is if you land in London, you can have really amazing food from all over the world and food that's created here by magpieing different ingredients from different cultures and mashing them all up.
Yeah.
And there is a stereotype that British food is really bad. And it's precisely because it was so bad that we had to be like, okay, well, this is pretty awful. Who else is doing cool things? Well, what can we do? How can we take the best bits of all these different things, mix them together and see how we can do interesting stuff? I did this series on the world's most expensive ingredients. And I went around some really fancy restaurants in Italy. I went there for truffle season, and Italy was beautiful. I love truffles. And we spent like 2 weeks going there filming things.
Oh, amazing.
And it sounds nice, right? And it sounds, especially as a food person, I was like, I count my days in Italy by not the number of nights, by the number of meals.
Yes.
I was like getting everything. What I discovered though in remote regional northern Italy is that all the restaurants, because they're local and seasonal, which we in the West value as being good, it means that there's 4 things on everyone's menu. Like wherever you go, there are the same 4 local, regional, seasonal specialities at that time of year.
Yeah.
And when you talk to chefs, if you talk to really high-end Italian chefs, one of the things that they complain about is that because there is one correct way to make a carbonara sauce, you can't do it in different ways because it's so sacred to them that there is a codified specific way in which you do them. Then you can't really be creative. And I think in the UK, because we lost a lot of our food culture, there's a vacuum and then you have to be more creative. So, yeah, I mean, that's all linked to plants.
Well, I've got to say, James, that sounds like a really tough gig. And
yeah, it was actually my favourite job I've ever done. Yeah.
Well, listen, if you need a co-presenter for series 2.
Okay, this series was like 10 years ago, but if they do a...
Start it up again.
They're doing, the Backstreet Boys are back, aren't they? So maybe we'll do a noughties revival.
Don't worry about Kate. I'll come with you.
Okay, good. We went to Japan. Not everything was great, right? Because the world's most expensive food isn't the best. So we had some horrible things in Japan, some very nice things, but like the Kobe beef and the value of the beef is that, or the fanciness of the rating is the higher the fat content in marbling.
Yes.
So if you have a steak which is 70% fat and you can't say no or express any displeasure, and it's basically like eating a beef flavored candle. It's just like fat. And it's just
That's a bad thing.
you have one bit and you're like, oh, this is nice. And then you're like, oh, great, I've got 250 grams of this tea.
Is that the same as Wagyu? Is that...
Yeah, so
What's
Wagyu, from my memory, I think is the breed.
Right.
Kobe beef has to be Wagyu beef from a specific bloodline in Kobe town or Kobe city. And then even they select different cuts. And so on the same animal, not all cuts will be certified as Kobe. So it's like really like Japanese really got to special.
What?
And it sort of was amazing, just not much of it.
I feel like we have just accidentally crashed into what the way that we like to end every single podcast is with what we call quick fire question.
Oh, okay, good.
So I don't know how quick fire this is going to be.
Right, got a stopwatch?
But if we were going to create a fantasy ticket for our listeners right now to go anywhere in the world, all expenses paid, to see one horticultural destination, where would it be other than Italy?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, if you, oh gosh. Okay, I'd say Singapore, and I'm biased because I grew up there and I visit there a lot. But what I would say is fascinating about it is they've spent a lot of money and time on horticulture, but they haven't done it because they think it's cute or aesthetic or it helps people out. They've done it in a very Victorian way. They've done it because it helps cool the center of a city, which would otherwise be uninhabitable in the tropics by the very function of it. It helps encourage foreign investment. It encourages tourism, and it also helps reduce the burden of ill health on the city. So all of this money has been spent, but not in a quaint middle-class hobby way. It's been spent on a practical way. And what that means is you see it on a ridiculous scale to which you don't see it in other countries. I often think that when we talk about the ideal of gardens in the UK, we look to Victorian horticulture. Victorian horticulture doesn't exist anymore. We just see preserved gardens of it. If you want to see Victorian British horticulture alive and well today with all of the culture behind it, you have to go to Singapore. So that wasn't a very short answer, but it's a true answer. I would recommend it.
But we get to go to Singapore, so I'm absolutely okay.
Oh, I didn't know there was budget for this. Okay, let's go. I'll buy the food. I know exactly where to go.
Could you name let's just say one plant that you think that everyone should grow that they don't already?
I mean, the thing is, everyone is different. As much as like we tend to think that the rest of the world thinks like we do, clearly, as if you just go on social media for 2 minutes, they clearly don't. I would say a plant that has given me a lot of joy that I think is underappreciated is I've been growing water lilies at home indoors. They're ridiculously easy to grow. Some people may not think they are. There are dwarf varieties you can grow. So I have a punch bowl at home, like a fruit bowl. I have a really dwarf variety called Helvola. The way you grow it is you put a lamp on top, like a desk lamp, on a timer, and you have that on for 12 hours a day. So it's like the simplest contraption ever. You never have to water a water lily. You can't mess it up. There's no pruning. There's no pests.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, and you can see the flowers of a water lily in the darkest days of December and picture that you're actually in July. Like, to me, it's the plant that gives me the most joy with the least amount of cost and effort.
Write that down, Kate.
That is amazing. Yes.
And the final question, and this might be quite difficult to answer, but could you say one thing that is your favourite thing about being an ethnobotanist?
Well, my favorite thing about I did think about this recently because it's also the worst thing about being an ethnobotanist is that I never have to work at all ever in my life because my hobby is the same as my job. When I go on holiday, I want to go down to the fruit and vegetable market in Korea or Colombia or wherever I am. And I want to go and talk to people and say, oh, what is that? How are you growing it? What are you cooking with it? Like, why is it important to you? What's its name here? Oh, that name is actually from the Chinese origin of this, or that name is from, and like, I love that. I mean, I recently went to Peru with work and I just spent the whole time talking to old ladies in markets. It's like the best day. So that's the good thing. The worst thing about that is that I'm on holiday and I was working. I was like making notes, I was taking photos. So, but the great thing about, I think a lot of horticulturists have this, because no one's in horticulture for the money, right? So it's, you're always working and you're never working. Like, it's a duality.
I think, well, just to be clear, we are absolutely in it for money.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Where's my Cristal champagne bucket?
On that, James, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you for making ethnobotany sexy.
I'm not just standing in that tunnel doorway doing this part's so heavy I have to flex while I'm holding it. I'm not doing your job for you.
James, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.